Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond and I'm your host for the next 60 minutes. Oh, by the way, this is our 70th show. A signal anniversary, really. You know, it's been another great day for British democracy. We hear from Sky News that the UK has abandoned climate change commitments made fairly recently in Paris to secure a trade deal with Oz. Despite this, apparently, this deal is still not done. Now, quite why the Australians want to abandon climate change commitments is a moot point, and I hope somebody is busy researching that right now. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we'll be talking to historian and author James Hawes about his books, his singing sessions with Line of Duty star Adrian Dunbar in Copenhagen, about the future of England and Scotland, and so much more besides. And he's taking your questions live. Details are on the What's On guide if you want to send us your comments and questions. And as you know, TNT stands for The Nation Talks. So in many respects, this is your show. We are live and we are free. So no license, no problem. You can enjoy the show. Now to our guest. Oh, I should tell you, by the way, and because it is important. Kevin, our producer, has COVID, and I hope you send your sympathies to him because, despite that, what a trooper! He's producing the show tonight. Well, how are you, James, and how has the pandemic affected you?
I'm very well. Very sad to hear about Kevin there. My younger brother has long COVID as well. I know it's a difficult thing to cope with. So fair play to him for keeping us going.
So tell us a bit about James Hawes. I've described you as an historian, a singer with Adrian Dunbar.
Among many others. I was initially a university lecturer in Ireland, where I learned the joys of singing in pubs. And got confident at it enough to do it for money and even beer. Beer and even money. A wild mixture of Irish rebel songs. And one of my great favourites was and is Bonnie Dundee. I could guarantee you to get a pub rocking along to that to this day. Strung me a guitar and gave me a pint. And then I started becoming a novelist. I became a teacher of creative writing. And then, thank God, a publisher called me up 5 years ago now and said, would you do the shortest history of Germany for nothing? And I loved the daring of saying that to me. And I was broke, and I just had a 3-month-old baby from my Irish, but genetically German, nationally heritage German wife. And I said, yes, I would do that for nothing. And luckily enough, it did very well all around the world. So we followed up with the shortest history of England, which is currently number 5 in the Times, I believe. So that's me. I'm English by birth and upbringing, but I'm also quarter Scot. I was brought up in Edinburgh in those vital years, the years 6 to 12, when you really, your life is laid down for you. So although your listeners may find this now slightly hard to believe, at the age of 12, I had a thoroughgoing Edinburgh accent, the proof of which is that when I came down to England, I got the crap kicked out of me for it and rapidly lost it. But I still, I could never, ever not cheer for Scotland, not just cheer, go wild for Scotland in the Calcutta Cup, for example. It's in there. We lived quite near Murrayfield. My father would take you down there and see the matches. So English, Scots. I'm married to an Irish Protestant, and I have 2 bilingual Welsh-speaking sons. So I am the United Kingdom. That sadly now doomed entity is me. So I'm fascinated, above all, with what's going to happen in Scotland, which is going to be the next place to leave it.
Interesting you should say that. And obviously, many people have had a chance to read your piece in Prospect magazine. Perhaps you could enlarge on that. You say that England, the future of England, is open, wide open, and that may in turn have a major impact on independence for Scotland. Why do you say that, and what is your contention?
My contention essentially is that the UK is not only doomed, but it has been doomed for over a century. And in a sense, one of my prize exhibits in the book is none other than Winston Churchill in 1912, of course, MP for Dundee at that stage, a Liberal MP for Dundee, trying to hold his beloved UK together, the center, this HQ of his beloved empire. And he put his finger on the fact that the force that was going to blow it apart was actually England. That it was England, the split within England, the dominance of the southern part of England within England, and its refusal to let go, that would make impossible his dream. And it's a dream which, in many ways, one has to regret. Don't forget, in 1912, very few people, even in Ireland, wanted full independence. On the other hand, lest we forget, there was a Scottish Home Rule Bill, of course, forgotten by so many people now, that was already on its way through Parliament in 1912. The UK was clearly collapsing. Churchill was desperate to hold it together, but he realized it could only work as a genuine union of free peoples who would each send their representative to what he called an imperial parliament. But he put his finger on the problem, was that England itself would have to be split up to make that work. And because it hasn't been, the UK is hopeless. And if anyone says that's exaggerated, all I can say, well, it's not me, it's Winston Churchill.
How do you visualize England being split up? Would it be north and south, or would it be?
Well, Churchill's words would it had to be divided into several great self-governing areas. Well, he mentioned in 1912, and he repeated himself in 1913. He mentioned that Yorkshire, Lancashire, and the Midlands could be given basically federal powers. The problem in England is this: that from the very beginning, since before it was called England, in fact, England itself is split. Now, to Scottish viewers, that's the familiar notion of the Great Glen splitting Scotland. England is just as split essentially by the River Trent. The whole geology, the whole agriculture, even the weather patterns are different north of that. And again in the history of England, that's been the split, the unacknowledged split, around which English politics goes around in this endlessly, like a black hole, really.
It's interesting too that you make them so there's just like the Great Glen, there's a geological split, and the Trent and the Humber, etc. You also make the point that that the elite in the south, in particular, had a specific approach to ensuring their dominance, even if it meant recruiting monarchs from elsewhere, if that worked. Tell us what you feel about that. You think
every country has its own traumas, its own past, its own splits. And I know this. When I was in Edinburgh at the age of 9, I was walking around going, "Hail, hail, the Pope's in jail, kick him in the googlies," having never no idea at all who the Pope was. So every country has its tensions and things. In England, the great one is that not only is the country split north and south, and always has been. The Venerable Bede noted this 1300 years ago, and a map drawn along the line described by the Venerable Bede is exactly the same as a map produced today saying social inequality in England. Exactly the same. But England uniquely, and this what makes England uniquely damaged in the whole of Europe, in my experience, and I know several countries in Europe very well, is that overlaid over that regional or almost national split within England, there is the class thing, which is the product of the fact that England was only ever really unified. That north-south divide was only ever really overcome by foreign conquerors. The first person to actually call England England in documents was Knut of Denmark, its first foreign colonizer. Just 50 years later, of course, comes the deluge for England with the Norman conquest, which meant that for the next, well, up till now, frankly, England, uniquely in Europe, has this elite which is culturally different, and everybody knows it. And I'm going to prove it to you right now. Your listeners might enjoy this. I could talk to you right now with only words taken straight out of the mouths of our Anglo-Saxon forefathers. Or we could continue this discourse employing vocabulary derived entirely from the French language. Now, those are both English, but they're different levels. And every Englishman, when he meets another Englishman, immediately knows which side of that he's on. So an Englishman knows straight away, are you north or south? He knows straight away, are you posh or not? Are you elite or not? Whatever the word is. And that leads to England itself being such a messed up country that one really doesn't know. I mean, I have no idea what's going to become of England when it is once again alone in the world, which it soon will be for the first time since 1707.
how do you think that will happen? I mean, there's lots of people watching us tonight and thinking, great, James, this is fantastic. This is the sort of news that I was hoping to hear. But they'll also be at the same time puzzled. They'll be saying, how is it going to happen? I mean, they'll take your point about England, I suspect, but they may still be thinking, how will that affect Scotland? I mean, how's that going to work?
Well, let's just start off by saying, by making it plain that the UK has been collapsing since 1921. I mean, the United Kingdom was only invented as a state in 1801 to control Ireland. Now, most of Ireland left, and frankly, all of it should have done in 1921. So what we now call the UK is since 1921 just a weird little rump, and no one really cared about what was left of Northern Ireland, which is why it was allowed to go its own sweet way into becoming a kind of bizarre paramilitary, one party, one governor state between the wars. Now, so first place, let's make it clear, the UK is collapsing. It's been held together probably by two world wars more than anything else. It will come, the collapse will come. It's been going for 100 years. How it will come is a fascinating question. I believe it'll come more quickly than we now expect. And that the immediate cause of that will be something which appears quite small initially and is certainly impossible to predict. For example, my first job was I was at university in Ireland. In my first job was as a lecturer of German studies, and half my colleagues there were experts in East German literature and culture. And none of us foresaw in the summer of 1989 that within a year Germany would be completely united again. We would have thought it was completely impossible. And the initial cause was simply that they opened the border between East Germany and Hungary to let some holidaymakers, to let some steam off, as they thought. And from that, the whole thing just unwound overnight almost. And something like that will happen. I can't predict what it might be. It could be a dispute over the nuclear submarine bases. It could be something to do with COVID. I was thinking, your listeners, viewers might like this idea. If you cast your mind back, dear viewers, to just two years ago, before the COVID epidemic, if someone had asked you then, can you think of any circumstances in which the Parliament of Scotland, the government of Scotland, will actually say it's going to close the border and turn English registered cars back? You would have said that's nonsense, that's science fiction, but it's happened. Something like that will happen. Now, under those circumstances, I was thinking this just earlier in the year when the lockdown was severe. Imagine now a very aggressive English lorry driver refuses to stop, and by refusing to stop, knocks down a Scottish policeman. And suddenly, you're in a kind of Northern Ireland situation, quite potentially there. When history is going in a certain direction, which it is, the tipping point will come from something small, but it will come.
It is extraordinary. And it's also extraordinary. You mentioned trucks and traffic being turned back at the Welsh border. But when I read some of the pronouncements by the Welsh First Minister, sometimes it sounds a bit like, even though he's Labour, it sounds like very nationalist tones. I mean, he uses the same sort of logic that a Scottish nationalist would use, except he's talking about Wales.
The fascinating thing, Welsh Labour is rapidly rebranding itself, I suspect, in the kind of semi-conscious realization that Wales will not be long after, if only out of national pride. Why would the Welsh put up with being the very last colony of England? They won't, once Scotland's gone.
Oh, you sort of hinted at the fact that Ireland might well be reunified at some stage fairly soon. Maybe I overdeveloped your remarks, but is that your feeling? Is that
Well, the Good Friday Agreement contains a provision that when it appears obvious, and I'm not sure the exact wording, and of course the devil's always in the detail, but there is wording which I don't know myself off the top of my head, which says that if it becomes self-evident, or words to that effect, that a majority would want to unite Ireland, a referendum must be held on it. Now, there's a new census this year in Northern Ireland, which will almost certainly confirm that is the case. The Loyalists only have a majority in the over 60s now. Again, history is going only one way there, and that, of course, is deeply tied up with Scotland, because the whole of modern Scottish loyalism, which many people point to, understandably, as a kind of the thorn in the dream of a new and wonderful free Scotland. That the birth of that is totally tied up with Ulster loyalism. It's unthinkable without it. It's really only a secondary effect of it. And once that situation is cured, then God willing, its nephew, its stepson, Scottish loyalism, will also have to think again about what on earth it's saying and to whom it's loyal. I mean, if there's an independent Scotland, to whom are loyalists loyal? To England? Really? That just doesn't play at all, does it? Either in Scotland or either in Ulster or I presume in Glasgow.
Well, I suppose. I mean, I have no knowledge of this, so I'm simply speculating. It's a shot in the dark. I suppose they might argue, well, we would remain loyal to the Queen, assuming she's still around. I mean,
well, again, that thereby hangs the whole tale, really, John. I mean, we need to look at the whole. If you look at the whole history of what we now call Great Britain and or the United Kingdom, because we get confused ourselves. The vital point about it is, and this is what I try to ram home in the book, is that if you look at the maps of the election, as soon as people got the vote, as soon as the majority of males got the vote in 1884, they voted in a way which showed that basically nobody wanted it. Great Britain and then the United Kingdom were constructed by elites with no consultation whatever among the common people of England, Scotland, Wales, or Ireland, any of them. They were elite constructs and they worked perfectly well until the common people got their own voice. And if you look at the maps of 1885, you will find that straight away our modern politics appears. Ireland votes to go nationalist straight away, and there's a league between the north of England and the Scots and Welsh against the south of England, which immediately turned and has remained Tory. That's the fault line. And what we call the Labour Party is really just a name for what I would call the Outer British Alliance, which is why the Labour Party, why thinking Labour Party people like my good friend John McTernan are so passionately opposed to the SNP, because they know in their hearts the Labour Party never was an English party at all. It was only ever a party of the United Kingdom, and then after Ireland left, of Great Britain. Without Scotland, it is nothing. It's no coincidence that its first 5 leaders were Scotsmen. You know, their frankly hatred of the SNP is grounded in the fact that they know it's killed the Labour Party as an entity. Without Scotland, it is dead. It cannot continue.
I think a lot of people will that what you just said will chime with them, because that seems to be almost a daily experience here, where third-rate politicians that occupy the opposition benches at Holyrood seem to be mouthing slogans that don't appear to make much sense. They're just opposition for opposition's sake. We now have a situation, for example, today.
That's why I say in that article which you kindly mentioned, John, I mean, if you look at those maps of the way we all voted as soon as we got the vote, it's exactly the same as the sides in the Civil War, really, with the small exception that Scotland very foolishly intervened on the side of Cromwell, you know, decisively in 1644. Without the Scots, Marston Moor would have been lost, undoubtedly, by Cromwell, and the king would have won the war. Now, pretty soon the Scots realised the error of their ways and fought for the king, obviously, at Dunbar, and were beaten by Cromwell then. But the sides in the Civil War were essentially the same as electoral maps of the late 19th century. But you have the trouble is that what we call the Gladstone's Liberal Party and then the Labour Party afterwards has this huge internal contradiction within that alliance, and that is this. The leaders of it have, you know, right from Gladstone right up to Blair, had to claim that they'd found some sort of magic formula which would both satisfy nationalists and keep the UK together. It started with Gladstone and Irish independence and going right up to Blair, saying that his devolution would you know, put an end to wishes for independence. And there's a clear contradiction in that. You know, why should the Scots and Welsh fight alongside the Northern English if they defeat the Southern English Tories, except to gain their independence? But the Northern English need them desperately. So the Labour Party, which has numerically always been based in the north of England, actually, desperately needs the Scots and, of course, the Welsh, the industrial Scots, the industrial Welsh, without whom it's nothing. And that's the root of its collapse.
That seems to be borne out by the opinion polls. I mean, even in the light of perhaps the worst UK government there's been for many generations, the Labour Party is languishing sometimes 5-10 percentage points behind.
Absolutely.
With the Liberals nowhere.
Because its backbone, its nature has gone. I say its fate was sealed, as was the fate of the UK in 2015. And those who blame Scotland for that should think twice, because if we remember in the general election of 2015, at that time, the SNP held the princely 6 seats before the election. And the Scotland had just, what everyone thinks of the vote, had just appeared to reaffirm its allegiance to the Union on the firm promise of everybody there'd be more devolution and we'd stay in the EU. But the general election of 2015, for the first time since 1745, the Conservative Party cast Scotland as virtually an enemy state. If you look back at the famous poster of Miliband being merely a puppet of Alex Salmond, or you look at the Daily Mail headline saying Nicola Sturgeon, the most dangerous woman in the country, and things like that. Scotland was basically cast as an enemy state, and Boris Johnson in particular approved that publicly. Other Conservatives, understandably, were somewhat scared of that because they realised the effect on the Union. Johnson thought it was great, and in that we see. I am of the opinion, I believe I've shown it in the book, that the secret motor of Brexit is a revolt of the Southern English against the UK as much as against Europe. If you look at the polls in 2018, 2019, everyone was astonished to see that a majority of Conservative voters, i.e. a majority of Southern English Conservative voters, the majority are always in the South, were perfectly happy to see Scotland leave, and even happy to see the Conservative Party destroyed in order to get Brexit. It was so ultimately it's a revolt of the Southern English who have again and again in history, whether it's the Civil War or whether it's Gladstone or whether it's Tony Blair, they hate the fact that they have at times been outvoted by this league of the Celts and the Northern English. Margaret Thatcher hated it above all. That's why she waged war on the miners, who were all from Northern England, Scotland and Wales, not coincidentally. It was the latest version of that battle.
You described the nationalism of the south of England as faux nationalism.
It's a very strange thing. I mean, the Conservative Party, since the dawn of democracy, the Conservative Party in the late 19th century, the Conservative Party has managed to persuade the Southern English that they are somehow the most favoured nation within the UK, never mind within the world, under the Empire. Now, their electoral tactic, which they needed to do before Ireland left because of the numbers, they had to chip away at the Celtic vote of the Outer British League. And they did so by absolutely embracing sectarianism. When we talk about sectarianism in Ulster, or we talk about sectarianism in Scotland, we have to remember that it was absolutely consciously had the bellows blown upon it by people like Randolph Churchill, by people like Bona Law, an Ulster Scot himself, who went around the place before the First World War, all but openly saying that they would support civil war rather than give Irish home rule, which was the policy of the democratically elected government of the UK at that time. So our deep divisions within what's blown the UK apart finally, and the catastrophic oppositions within it, is all come down to that sense that somehow the south of England must rule the rest completely, and we'll try to divide and rule to split the support away from the outer British.
So is it your view that Boris Johnson in that case is not some aberration, but in fact an extension of an established trajectory?
Absolutely. I mean, I put it, as I say in the book, I mean, basically what happened is that under Johnson, the Conservative Party has embraced the destiny which was actually manifest since 1885 and become the party the party of the Southern English nationalists. That was always its natural fate. And so you can see that if you just look at the maps of 1885 and onwards, any electoral map from 1885 to the present day will show the whole southeast of England as a solid Tory fortress. Now, why is that? It's tribal. And that's the secret of UK politics, which someone like Peter Mandelson understood, which is why he famously said that the next Scottish leader had to be born in Scotland, as were both Blair and Brown, but he had to be able to appeal to the English South, because Mandelson realised it's all about tribes in UK politics. The Southern English are a different tribe from the Northern English. The tribe of the Northern English seeks to ally with the tribes of Scotland and Wales in order to defend itself against the Southern English. It's Game of Thrones, basically. It's not politics, not ideology at all. And that's why I wouldn't wire my head about what the ideology of independent Scotland is. That's a secondary question, because UK politics is fundamentally not about ideology. It's about tribal identities, and always has been.
And Charles Smith is asking the question, do you think that England has been captured by the City of London?
Well, southern England has always been centred on London. When talking about since the days of the Tudors. The Tudors were the first who really tried to impose the dominance of southern England on the rest of Britain. And for them, since the 18th century, really, the idea of London as a centre of a world trading financial empire, as opposed to the north of England or Scotland and Wales, the industrial Scots and Welsh, with mines and steelworks and so forth, has become firmly entrenched. So that basically, the problem is that the economies of the south of England and the rest of the UK are they're just completely incompatible. What's good for one is bad for the other, because what's good for someone who wants utter free trade, free flows of capital, no tariff barriers and things, is directly bad for nations or regions which need to have things like the shipyards protected. And so that you simply cannot please them both at the same time, which is why we see, say, in the 1920s, where the government of the Conservative government in the 20s just embraced going back to the gold standard, which was catastrophic for industry from Belfast to Glasgow to the north of England to South Wales, but great for the City of London, who was what wanted it.
So if you had to depict a picture of England, say, 10 years from now, what would it look like?
It will be alone in the world for the first time since 1707. It will be a country deeply split, because once the kind of the smokescreen of Great Britain and the UK has finally left the stage, you will see a country as divided in 10 years as it was when the Venerable Bede, 1300 years ago, first talked, as he did 9 times in his book, about the fundamental split between Northerners and Southerners. And England will then be faced in a bizarre way with its own kind of post-colonial situation of having to decide what the hell it really is, after all these years of this strange situation of being itself under the sway of a culturally foreign elite and being bossing around its smaller neighbours. The result is, as I'm afraid, I don't think it's going to be pleasant at all, because the English, in particular the Southern English, have for so long been told by their betters for their own reasons that they are somehow special, they're somehow entitled, they have a right to so in the world, that rather like the Russians, they are now prey, we see it in Brexit, they've fallen prey to mad conspiracy theories about how someone has robbed them of their victory. No, we won the war, but the Germans cheated us of the peace. That we had an empire, now someone's stolen it from us. Who was that, And that sense of an entitlement gone lost is one of the most dangerous political things, as we see in America. If a group of people who feel that they were once on top and are now no longer, and have been cheated of that by the bad guys, they are very dangerous. And I myself have quite dark thoughts about where England might be in 10 years.
Yeah, it is. It seems to resonate with the whole Brexit debate, which seemed to be predicated upon we've been cheated by Europe. They are twisting, they're distorting. If we leave, we'll get £350 million for the NHS per week or whatever. Just nonsense, frankly.
It was nonsense, and it was always in the back of their minds right from the early 90s when they began. Remember John Major calling them bastards, all these people like the young Daniel Hannan and his older friends then. Their dream was always to be, to all intents and purposes, the 52nd state of America. It was this thing of the Anglosphere that people like Niall Ferguson talked about so much in the 90s. The Ulster Scots values, and at that stage they talked to the whole of Britain. That's what's so fascinating. The 90s anti-EU people thought they'd take the whole of Britain away with Ulster Scots values to join in a kind of Anglosphere. But later on they changed that to this myth of England defending itself against Europe, because they changed their focus, they changed their whole story to appeal to a particularly English votership. And as the professor of social geography at Oxford has pointed out, it doesn't matter who had the highest percentages, the votes for Brexit stacked up in the south of England.
It's interesting. You've been interviewed recently on German television about Scotland and matters British. What were you saying to the German viewers and listeners?
I explained to them that if there were a hard Brexit, which has now happened, Scotland would be independent in 5 years. I put my money on the table there, and it's still lying there, and I think it's looking pretty bright.
Well, it's interesting that, what reaction do you get in Germany generally? I mean, this is a very loose question for which I apologize, but if I don't ask it, people will be thinking, you ought to have asked James that.
It's kind of disbelief, which I also get a lot in England, when people say, what do you mean the UK collapsed? How can such a wonderful thing? And I say, well, look, what happened to Ireland in 1921, for God's sake? Do you have any idea about history? That A, it has been collapsing for a long time, and B, of course things go. The USSR collapsed. The British Empire collapsed, for crying out loud. When my mother was born, we still owned India and half of Africa, for crying out loud. All that's gone. So why should not the UK and the GB go too, please? There's nothing holy about them.
Yeah. It reminds me of the old joke about the Irish child who was shown a map of the world with all this red from end to end. And the teacher said, what do you think, Johnny, about the empire? Do you know the sun never sets on the British Empire? What do you think of that? And he said, that's because God doesn't trust the British in the dark. An old one, but probably fairly valid in some respects. But so people, is there any sense? Are you invited on those shows because you understand Scotland and Ireland, or are you invited because they need somebody from the UK to talk generally about the UK?
Well, mainly it's because I wrote a book called The Shortest History of Germany, which identified, a complete geographical and cultural split in Germany, which most Germans likewise were not really aware of. Again, most Germans would think that the East-West split, which is really clear if you look at their voting patterns to this right now, that's somehow a product of the Soviet occupation for 40 years of East Germany and West Germany, and it's not at all. Those patterns go back way, way beyond. The east and west of Germany have always been very, very different places. I mean, what's now East Germany, there wasn't a single German living there until almost 1200. It was a colony, and so in fact, it's interesting. It happened exactly the same time as the British tried to colonize Ireland, and for some of the same reasons, climactic and so forth. The weather was much better then, so poor areas were suddenly highly desirable. And in both cases, what you get is a long colonial situation which fundamentally alters politics. So people who live in a colony, like Ulster Protestants, for hundreds of years, if you live in a place where for hundreds of years you think, and quite understandably, that the people who you took the land from are still there, and one fine night they might knock you on the head unless you're careful, you will over the generations develop instinctively an authoritarian, us and them way of looking at things. That was a situation of the Germans beyond the River Elbe, surrounded as they were by Slavic peoples, and us to this day still are. It was a situation of the French in Algeria. It's a situation of the whites in South America, surrounded by black population who they'd enslaved, and it was a situation of the Protestants in Ireland. It's not a question of guilty conscience. It's just the fact damn well they're still there, and damn well they don't like you much. In fact, they probably hate your guts. And if you do not maintain a kind of paramilitary government which will ride to the rescue with yeomanry or cavalry or whatever at any given moment and use the iron fist, those guys might well come back one day and take back the house. So living in a colony makes people very, very different. It's neither good for colonizer nor colonized. And it's almost the worst case is a half successful colonization, because then you have the situation is never finally decided. And that's why I get invited on German shows. Anyway, to answer your question in a roundabout way, because I've tried to show them their own history, and I'm glad to say the book has been a pretty big bestseller in Germany, because I've opened their own eyes. So I'm hoping to open England's eyes to England's own question, because the English don't like to think of themselves as a kind of troublesome split country, which they are.
It's interesting. We've had a number of requests for details on how viewers can get your books.
In all good bookshops. It's in the windows of every Waterstones in the country, I believe, he said modestly. So,
no, but seriously, I mean, and I presume they can get it through Amazon if they're COVID.
They can if they so wish. Although I prefer they got it through a nice little independent bookshop, obviously, since they pay tax.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Is there? I would like to get your views on a debate that's fairly active in Scotland, because we have now a range of independence parties. We've got the SNP, we've got Alaba, we've got the Greens. The SNP and the Greens are now in government together, but we've got a whole bunch of other parties, ISP and others. The question is this. Some people take the view that the best thing to do, since you can't trust Westminster, is to cut and run, use any device you can, UDI, whatever, and just go for it. Other folks say, no, cool it, take your time, use a referendum, do it in a thoughtful, measured way. What's your take on that?
I'd go for both. I would, I'm a specialist in the long waves of history, and I can tell people that history is only going in one direction.
Keep talking. I need to plug in my computer. So I shall disappear for a second.
History is only going in one direction. The UK has been collapsing since 1921. Scotland will be independent soon. On the other hand, history doesn't work on autopilot. It needs people to push it forward. So I would say to kind of go forward in confidence, not feel that you have to be hurried if that means you're falling into some kind of trap laid by someone like my wicked and cunning friend John McTernan. You know what I mean? Time is on the side of Scottish independence very clearly. And so while people should be pushing forward by any means, including the UN, including Europe, I personally would be lobbying very hard to try and get France or Germany to say publicly, yes, we will welcome you back in straight away if you go independent, for example, which would change the game entirely and make it a question of months rather than years.
Yeah.
But all these tactics should be tried short of falling into something like, okay, we're going to send out the fiery cross and close the border tomorrow, which would probably be hasty, although romantic, I have to say.
So your view is that you've got a range of implements or tools. You need to use those as it requires as you work your way through this, and the support of people from other countries is helpful. I mean, I take your point. I mean, it'd be very difficult, mind you, for Germany or France to say you can rejoin the EU right away because the EU has certain rules, and I think it would upset other countries if Scotland got a free pass, as it were. But you could join EFTA with a view to joining the EU over time, I suppose.
Or even an official statement that both Paris and Berlin would look favourably upon an application. That's all it would take, I suspect.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a fundamental legal question. We've seen a lot in the papers recently how Tony Blair's own advisors have said openly that they suspect that Scotland does actually have the legal right to call a referendum whether Westminster like it or not. Now, that would count as a slow and careful approach for me. Anything that's couched in the terms of law. And because the way the devolution parliaments were set up, there was deliberately a kind of grey area in their powers where that was left purposely, I think, by Blair and the people who advised him, a little fuzzy. And if you can use a legal route which you discover, then so much the better. I don't think physical force is the answer, really.
No, and I take it you're not terribly much in favour of a UDI.
Well, no. If unless it had powerful support from somewhere else, I think. I mean, at the end of the day, every declaration of independence is a UDI in one way or another. Because one person is saying, okay, now you no longer have the power to block us. So it's all UDI. It's not a qualitative difference, I don't think. So push at it, but don't fall into any traps would be my advice. In the knowledge that time is on your side.
Can we move on to talking about the claim of right? Because the claim of right has been passed by both Holyrood and Westminster. And it contains a statement to the effect that sovereignty in Scotland rests with the people. Now that seems to me to be a fairly broad concession by a parliament in Westminster, which regards sovereignty being invested in the Crown and Parliament. These are quite different concepts.
Absolutely. No, that's it. The devil, or in this case, the angel, is in the detail. And it may have been that someone drafted that carelessly they will now say, but nevertheless it's there. It's accepted in law. And I think that I think the current state of play, where you have a coalition, it makes that claim all the stronger, because the fact that you do have a majority now, not composed of one party, for the very good reason, of course, and your viewers may be interested to hear this, that I came across a paper, rather my son, Owain, who's a Welsh-speaking devolution expert, found me a paper in which in 1997, the then secretary of the Labour Party in Scotland, a man called MacDonnell, actually said, in black and white, that the arrangements they'd agreed for the upcoming assembly was specifically designed to prevent the SNP ever becoming the largest, ever having a majority. So the fact that it now, with the Greens, has won is an extraordinary turnaround, and it goes to show that really nothing can stop history, Yeah. So yes, I mean, I would use every legal instrument. Absolutely, that counts as slow and steady. When I say slow and steady, I mean just don't start throwing bottles necessarily, but pushing absolute to the limit of what is or could be the law.
Interesting. We're moving along smartly here, but I need to ask you how you ended up singing with Adrian Dunbar in Copenhagen. The line of duty has never struck me as a style.
It wasn't many years ago. It was in the year 2001, I think. I was doing a film thing, and I had my then partner with me, who was a wild and beautiful, ferocious Welsh nationalist and Welsh speaker. And we ended up in Adrian Dunbar's room, and he began singing her Irish songs. And I could see that, I was in big danger here, because how could a mere Englishman compete with Adrian Dunbar singing Irish songs to a Welsh nationalist? But I managed to fish out Bonnie Dundee, in fact, and sing that a full belt, which was just enough to win her back. So a score draw there. I left the room with the girl, despite it being Adrian Dunbar.
You've also been involved in some productions on TV. I mean, you're...
Least said the better there, by the way.
Really? But you are a series story consultant on the BBC's upcoming landmark 7-part TV documentary, The Making of Us, which is a story of creativity.
That's going to be great. That's going to be really good fun. I mean, it's a big thing. I suspect I'm probably not allowed to talk about it that much at the present, because it's under wraps. It's still becoming what it is. But it's say the BBC themselves call it a landmark, and I think rightly it's going to be a really interesting new look at why these islands. And I use the word. There are things we have in common, why these islands are so creative. And it's not because we're a peaceful bunch of polite Southern Englishmen. It's because we are a set of islands riven again and again by massive tensions and invasions. And I do think, because you see, one important point for your viewers to understand is this: the army, proud Edward's army, that invaded under the two Edwards, 1-0 at Stirling Bridge, drawn at Falkirk, then finally defeated at Bannockburn. That army was entirely officered by French speakers. Really? It was not, to call it an English national army is a very strange thing, because when Robert de Bruce famously did his single combat with Brian de Bohun before the Battle of Bannockburn, both of them would have given an answer to the challenge in French. And that's important, because it's dangerous, and I think counterproductive for us now to try to map on modern nationalisms onto events in the past too tightly. We do not want a situation where nationalists anywhere, whether English or Scottish nationalists, cast it as an us and them of the ordinary people. Let us recall that the proud Edward's army, the English were mere grunts and servants to the French-speaking officers who ran it. The entire record of King Edward I's campaign in 1294 is in French still. Yeah, and of course Bruce and Balliol were themselves members of that Norman elite which King David had brought into Scotland deliberately in the 12th century. So let's not get into a kind of national populism on the kind of Russian, the Ukraine mode of saying, because of our history, I therefore hate you because of whatever you are. Because the common people of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and England were nothing to do with the creation of Great Britain or the United Kingdom. And the fact that they all actually want out of it with the interesting exception of the Northern English, because they need the Celtic allies to defend themselves against the Southern English. It means that we do have things. We are more like each other in many ways than we are like French or Germans. We all buy rounds, for example, which no German ever buys a round back. Have you noticed that? An Irishman, Welshman, Scotsman, Englishman will do that. But it's got to be on the basis of genuine free choice of the nations, of modern democratic nations freely choosing to associate as equals. That's the key. And that demands that Scotland, Wales, and Wales become independent first and then choose. If it is true, as I think it is, that there is something, we are in some ways like each other, we're neighbours, for God's sake, we trade with each other, we are all entwined in history, the battles we fought in the wars and so forth. But that has to be a free choice made by free nations.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with much of what you've said. I don't want to get you into trouble by talking any more about about creativity, apart from what the fairly general remarks you've just made. But you reckon you've also done a couple of screenplays with Rhys
Those are the ones I don't want to talk about.
And Michael Sheen.
Yes, I managed to blow, just despite having Rhys Evans and Joe Fiennes in one film and Michael Sheen in the other one, they managed to both be a complete crock of shite, if you excuse my French. Due to the simple fact that I, in my youthful arrogance, didn't realize that writing a screenplay is an entirely different craft with its own rules and its own skills. And I just thought, I'm a best-selling novelist, I can do this. The result was utterly disastrous. But we live and learn, you know?
We live and learn. We've been asked, one of the questioners is asking, what would the rump UK be called? Lower Britain, Lesser Britain?
It should have, the rump UK should have been called, it should have gone back to being called Great Britain, clearly. And as I say, the fact that people realise how ridiculous the partition of Ireland was, we can see in the fact that Westminster just ignored Ulster for the next 20 years until the beginning of the war when it needed it again, and just let it go its own way, becoming this weird state. James Craig was the Prime Minister for life, effectively, of a one-party state, effectively, which was a paramilitary state, effectively, within the UK.
Yeah.
Crazy stuff. But for me, the most fascinating thing about what will be of the UK and about the leaving of Ireland is this, and it's one of the things I really wanted to say to your viewers about what an independent Scotland would be like, because I have a truly wonderful scheme, radical scheme for what that would be like, and I have 4 words to say to your viewers: the Irish Land Acts. When Ireland was part of the UK, the government at Westminster enacted acts which had the effect of turning Ireland from a country where 95% of the land was owned by a few big landowners, grouse moors and things, and everyone was just a tenant, into a country where everyone owned their own farm. That's the closest thing to the Russian Revolution. It was done by the Westminster government at huge expense. They provided the mortgages for it. And I think that's the way ahead for Scotland. You have enough there, and according to the grouse lobby itself, and I should say I'm no anti-hunting man. I've been hunting with dogs and I liked it several times. But the grouse lobby itself, who are not going to underestimate these things, admit that there is enough land as grouse moor in Scotland to give every single person, not every single house, every single person half an acre. Now, think about what that means. It means if you were to nationalise that and apportion it on the basis of properties, say that every tower block in Dunfermline or every street in Glasgow or each village in the borders owns 2,000 acres, and it's tied to the properties. So whenever you move house, that's part of the title of that property you take with you, to do with as you wish, within limits of conservation and sustainable development and all that. You would transform the Highlands from this utter myth, which I despise. My grandmother's from the Highlands, from Cromarty, which is in the Highlands. Her family moved from the Highlands in the clearances to Cromarty, forced to become fishermen. Ian Rankin now owns her house, I'm delighted to say. But that kind of, the austere beauty of the Highlands is entirely a thing of the last 250 years caused by kicking the people out. We could regenerate. Scotland could be turned into a country people long to live in. Imagine a country where you say to people, if you come and live in Scotland, you are automatically, when you buy a flat in Dundee, you are also automatically part of a group of people who between them, a small group of people, a little community, who between them own 2,000 acres of the Highlands. To be wild, to build forests on, to put log cabins on, to have lovely new roads powered by Scottish wind-powered electricity with the power. charge rates right the way up to them, like the road to Fort William transformed things in the 18th century. You would turn the Highlands from a tourist vision of woe, bleak beauty into somewhere alive again with people.
And do you think that would work economically? Because right now you see what sustains a lot of the Highlands is tourism. And I can't imagine tourists being terribly greatly attracted to individual crofts and things, would they?
It wouldn't be crofts. It would be just large sections of what's now Grouse-Moor would be turned by the new community owners into different things, into a meadow full of wildflowers, or an oak forest, or whatever they wanted to do with it. There would be limits. You wouldn't be allowed to go and build a coal-fired power station, obviously, but it would be alive again with people. And I think people go to, in the same way as they go to the Swedish lakes. You'd have a country of people who, like the Canadians and like the Swedes, all have a bothy in the Highlands, a communal one in this case, perhaps. And yeah, tourism is fine, but tourism is a very double-edged industry, as you know. In my opinion, my humble opinion, it breeds a certain kind of civility, a certain kind of what my Irish friends call the bored vulture smile, meaning a false smile of welcome when they're really after the money. It doesn't sustain many jobs directly. The grouse industry itself only claims 4,000, which is nothing for 10 million acres, and you can have 4,000 jobs. Forget it, So I would hope that an independent Scotland would have the vision to just totally transform itself the way Ireland was transformed, by legislation, by not forcible expropriation, but the buying up with mortgages, with borrowed money, as the English government did in Ireland, of the estates with long-term mortgages, backed by the World Bank, backed by Europe, backed by whoever, to transform the land ownership of Scotland, which is a historical huge problem in Scotland.
That's a very good point. I need to ask you a question. We've got about 9 minutes left. It's a question I ask every non-supporter of independence who takes a particular view on a unionist view on the Constitution. But I wanted to get your answer on this as well, please. Their view, when I asked them, why is there no right-wing nationalist party in Scotland? Because as a historian, you will know that if you look across the world, it's very common to have right-wing nationalist parties when there's a secessionist move, separation is being considered. Why do you think there's no right-wing nationalist party in Scotland?
I think it's because that brand of right-wing populism that we see quite terrifyingly in Russia, we see it absolutely, and also terrifyingly in Trump's America, and we see it in Brexit. We see it on the wings of some people in France, the descendants of the people who tried to kill de Gaulle now, is always, and in the AfD in Germany, of course, it's a product of people who were once in a colonial position of supremacy. And it's that feeling that your position as top dog has been robbed from you, as you said earlier, by some evil conspiracy of someone, whatever it is, that leads you to embrace these really kind of, whether it's blood and soil or racist or whatever you call it, attitudes towards other people and propose that you are somehow better than them, either culturally, genetically, or whatever it's going, whatever nonsense it is. And the countries which have not had that experience, such as Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Scotland very briefly had a colony in Darien, as we know, disastrously, but in effect, neither Scotland nor Ireland or Wales ever had a kind of Irish or Scottish or Welsh empire over whom they were told they were better. Because what happens when you have those situations is that the people in charge tell the ordinary grunts, you're better than them. You are, because you're one of us, and what makes you better is you're part of this culture, this race. That's never happened. Now, arguably, it happened a bit to all the people in the British Isles or the Anglo-Celtic Isles during the Empire, but it happened most to the English, clearly. And because that hasn't happened, you don't get that kind of strident, revanchist, the past was great sort of nationalism, because why would anyone in Scotland, Wales, or Ireland think that the past was a great, triumphant place? Kind of hard to sell that one, whereas to an American or Russian or a Briton or some Germans, you can still sell that idea to them that things were great in the old days, we're going to take it all back.
Quick question about Germany, if I may. There's an election coming up soon. Who do you think is going to win it?
The polls all say the Social Democrats and the Greens, whether they have enough together to make a coalition, seems to be the only question now outstanding. And I'm very delighted about it because 3 or 4 years ago, you had all these people, the Brexit boosters, talking about the death of German social democracy, how the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, their kind of Brexit party, was going to be taking over and everything. It's gone nowhere. And I was saying at the time, don't worry, it will not happen. So I know it's good to put your cards on the table and be proved right. So I'm delighted to see that the Germans, as they always have done for the last 50 years, 75% of them are going to vote for parties which can make coalition parties together, all of whom support NATO, all of whom support the EU. They're all basically decent, normal people. Democracy has to be able to put up with 10% of loonies or 15% of loonies, as long as the centre holds. So I think Europe should be very grateful that the German centre is holding there. And it should be a lesson to us all, maybe not to listen too strongly to the siren voices of mad poets. I remember when I went to Sarajevo and I talked to some guy there who's been in charge of some Serbian artillery brigade bombing the place. And he said, yes, before that I was a professor of French poetry. I said, but it's so much more fun firing artillery. The poets and the academics are always the dangerous ones because they're the ones who propose the mad extremes. So let's, God bless, quiet progress towards a secure and certain goal, I would say.
Cool. Are there any thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with that James Hawes, speaking to a fairly eclectic bunch of people who are watching and listening tonight, any specific points that you feel that you thought you would like to leave with them?
I think fundamentally, I hope people will go away from this program, John, and just think, good gracious, really, it's true. The UK is not some holy eternal organization. It's just a thing that was invented in 1801 and has been collapsing since 1921 and was given the death sentence in 2019 and is going to die very soon, the way things do. And that even Great Britain, constructed as it was without any consultation with either the Scottish or English people, for that matter, that is not a holy institution either. And that too will soon be doomed. And that Scotland leaving the UK stroke GB will be an earth-shaking event in what it does to England, to Scotland, to Ireland, and even to Europe. It's the end of a huge chapter in the history of these islands and the beginning of something new.
Yeah, it's your fan club is on tonight. George Aitken is saying, James, you are an inspiring person. Thank you.
It's just trying to be honest, John, because I think that my job as a kind of historian I am is to see through all the detail and all the myths and the political things and just look at the long sweep of things and see how things came to be, what is past and passing and to come, as the poet Yeats put it. And if I can help people do that, I'd be delighted.
Other folks are saying, Stephen Kelly says, great show, James. Thank you. Grace Ward Carrick says, this has been a most interesting talk tonight. Such a clever man. Jackie Jensen.
Jackie, I'm blushing, as you can see, I am.
Jackie Jensen says, really enjoyed this discussion. I learned lots. Thanks, James.
A great pleasure, great pleasure.
What can any historian wish more than their readership and their audience chimes with what they have to say?
The pleasure of that never fades, I have to say, John. It's just lovely to hear that. So thank you to all your kind viewers who said that. It really does make your day.
Well, these are completely unsolicited. I mean, these are folks who've been watching and listening to you tonight. And I think it would be wrong of me to try and suggest why they're saying the things they're saying, aside from the fact that you have been hugely entertaining and educational, and it's been a really excellent experience all round. Because, I mean, I think a lot of people have learned a lot from what you've been saying tonight, because apart from anything else, what you've been saying is not covered in the mass media.
No.
Aside from this show, right? James Hawes would not have been known about, I suspect, by a lot of people watching and listening tonight.
No, that's certainly true. I'm very grateful for it.
And it's interesting that it's
the way things get lost. To say, John, one of the things you just mentioned in passing, this extraordinary fact that how many people not watching this show are aware that there was a Scottish independent or Home Rule Bill for Scotland on its way through Parliament as the policy of the government of the day when the First World War stopped things. That's when I say the history is going one way. I mean, the evidence is there before our eyes.
Yeah, no question. Excellent, super. Thank you very much indeed, James.
It's been a huge pleasure, and due to my childhood, I always love to hear a Scottish accent, I have to say.
Let me make a few concluding remarks, if I may. Big thank you to James, obviously. A big thank you to all of you for watching tonight. Many of you have enjoyed the show. That's terrific. Tell your friends and neighbours so that they can enjoy it too. As ever, we have some great guests lined up for future shows. And this is a place for the big hitters. Next week, we're back at the same time with another special guest, and that's Yes activist Mike Fennick. He'll be joining us next Wednesday. I hope you'll be joining us too. And always a reminder to look out for the Constitution column in the 7 Days supplement in the Sunday National. Dr. Elliot Bulmer will be talking about a few of the references that James has made tonight about how the elite in Scotland have become somewhat estranged from the whole question of independence and why that might likely change. Thanks again. Please join us next Wednesday. And remember, it's been a great day for British democracy. We hear that Boris Johnson still plans to attend the climate change meeting in Glasgow, despite reneging on climate change commitments. What's new? So to all of you, thanks for joining us this evening. A big thank you to James. Please stay safe and take care. Good night, everyone.
Good night.